I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, and this is our podcast. On this podcast, Tom and I have set out to talk about music. This podcast is devoted to discussion about music. Now, unfortunately, just the way things are today, we can't have a conversation outside of just Tom and I talking to one another on this podcast. Maybe someday we can work that into a podcast episode, Tom, where we get other people calling in and we can have this big organic discussion about a musical topic.
Awesome.
That would be sweet, wouldn't it? But today it's really just you and me. And from as long as I've known you, Tom, we've been talking about music, having these big elaborate discussions.
Day one.
and the significant others in our lives and now our wives have been rolling their eyes as we talk about music constantly, and they just want us to move on to something that they find more interesting than us just blabbering about music. And
I don't know what that would be.
I don't know what that is.
I don't know what they want from us, Jake.
Yeah, and and as we've gotten into like doing album reviews on Velocities in Music, and then as we ended the album reviews, we've really both been digging into lists more.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a major turning point for me personally, because music listening before, I didn't have as much exposure as you did to music at such an early age. You really switched away from the radio at a very early age. Like you were probably like 8, 9 years old when you started just like diving into albums.
I have my family to thank for that.
You do.
I wasn't
You're the youngest.
Yeah, as an 8-year-old, I wasn't just going to like music stores. And
you were the youngest. You had 3 older brothers, and your dad was, he had a music studio when you were a kid and everything. And that is a hugely valuable experience. Now, my dad, I remember, and I've told this story before, but like I remember my dad when I was 8, and I was into just like the local pop radio station, Chumbawamba, the first album I ever bought and stuff. I was into music like that, Chumbawamba, Savage Garden, stuff like that.
There you go. It was on
90s.
the radio. There's worse music than that. Give yourself some credit.
Yeah, I remember my dad pulling me aside and maybe making me listen to the classic rock radio station in Des Moines, KGGO, and getting into Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and all the classic
Bon
rock.
Jovi.
Yeah, of course.
Just kidding.
Actually, we don't like Bon Jovi. That's another podcast.
Yeah, it's a sore subject.
So, but from that, there's a ton of artists that even in the classic rock era that were kind of underneath the covers that aren't played on the radio, and a ton of music that I've been exposed to through Tom forcing lists down my throat. When we started Velocities in Music back in like 2012, you started going through Rolling Stone's top 500.
Yeah. And
I remember just being completely intimidated by the fact that on top of all the music we were listening to for album reviews, you were also going through this top 500 list. And since then, we have started like developing lists for all these other things, all these other different subject matters. And today, the reason why I'm speaking about all this is because today's podcast is on a list. And this is the first type of this podcast we've done. We've done about, 14, 15 podcasts now? Something like that. And got a few more planned. And today marks the first list we're going to go through. And this is the best Tom and my, Velocities in Music's, favorite double album list.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is the first list, a new type of podcast we're going to be doing. You're going to see a lot of lists before, and really, how we're going to approach this is we'll go from the top 10 albums, starting with number 10 and working our way up to number 1. There's going to be some, if you just Google, top double album lists or whatever list we're doing on these podcasts, you're probably going to see a lot of consistency with those other lists, but hopefully Tom and in my quirky personalities, we throw in some additional flavor there.
Right.
And that's kind of how we expect most of your lists out there to go.
Right, because we're not a comprehensive music publication.
No.
We're not a conglomerate of a bunch of people. We're just two dudes.
Yeah, we're just two dudes talking about music, and our lists are no better than anyone else's. And the other thing is, like, keep in mind, we're saying our favorite double albums.
Not authoritatively best.
Not authoritatively best. I did use the word best, and that was a mistake. It's not the best, because if we wanted to argue the best, that would be a much bigger debate. This is just our favorite. So what we'd like to do is talk about what makes a good double album, and what constitutes a double album. We also want to talk about the inherent risk of making a double album, how that affects the listening experience of an album. And we'll go through the list. We'll kind of give a summary of our top 10. We'll post a top 25 list outside of this, but we're only going to cover top 10. here, and then afterwards we'll kind of talk about some themes that we saw, and figure out what your guys' lists are, because double albums. I mean,
we're gonna leave some stuff off, and we'll try to address as much as we can.
I wish we could cover more of this. Maybe we'll do a part 2 someday.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So Tom.
All right.
When we started off making this list a couple weeks ago of our favorite double albums, it was tough because there are so many albums out there that are very long.
Yes.
But they're not technically a double album.
Right.
So what constitutes as a double album in your mind?
To me, it comes back to the original format in which the album was released, recorded, produced. I think that an artist sets out with a vision for making a double album, and it's really got to be defined by the artist.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we even see the same thing between EPs and LPs. If something is 25 or 30 minutes long, is it an EP or an LP? Well, I think that's really to be determined by the artist. I think the artist should be able to define the scope of their work. But double album, of course, it corresponds directly with the length of the actual content, how much music is on there. And that's where formats and different eras of music really come into play, because with the advent of the compact disc, it could hold up to about 80 minutes of music,
right.
Whereas, back in the 60s, 70s, back in there when double albums were really starting to become a more acceptable thing and a more common thing in music, it was more like, typically anything, maybe around over 55 minutes to an hour would be considered a double album, because you'd have to press it onto 2 records.
Right.
So just naturally...
4 sides.
Right. There is kind of a discrepancy there, because you've got a lot of albums, mostly in the 90s, it seemed like artists started to get a little more adventurous, and they would put out these albums that were like 70, 75 minutes long, that if pressed to vinyl, if created in the 60s or 70s, would have to be a double album.
If not triple.
Right. And there were plenty of triple albums as well. But what they had to do then was... press it to compact disc, or I don't know if you call it press, burn it to a CD,
right.
And it's a different format. So, you
Laser etch.
Right. You've got artists like Tool, who notoriously put out several albums above 60 or 70 minutes in length.
Yeah, the Mars Volta come to mind. How many 80-minute albums have they released?
Definitely. Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magic is a little over 70 minutes. That's still considered one disc. If it was released 20 years prior, it wouldn't have been, or they would have had to pare down the content to be able to fit on 2 sides of a record.
So it really comes down to artist intent.
It does, because there are even some more modern double albums that could fit onto one CD, like Baroness's Yellow and Green comes to mind. I believe M83's Hurry Up, We're Dreaming.
Oh yeah, good point.
Those you could actually burn it onto one CD. I'm pretty sure. But still, if the artist chooses to release it as a double album, then it must be for some conceptual and thematic reason. And even that doesn't mean it has to be a concept album, but it just means that in the artist's mind, they find a logical breaking point in the flow of songs to create really 2 combined listening experiences. I actually think we saw the same thing with Arcade Fire's Reflector.
Oh, that's a good point.
Another one that they decided to make that a double album. I actually don't quite remember the exact length of that. It might have been a little over 80 minutes. But still, it's something that they could have pared down to one album, could have shortened up, but they wanted it to be a double album.
That's a great album to transition to the next precursor topic I want to talk about, which is the inherent risk that a double album brings, that format brings to the album listening experience. In the case of Arcade Fire's Reflector, it really, I don't think that making it a double album really did that body of work any favors.
Right.
Because inherently, when you build a double album, when an artist, choreographs all the different tracks in a double album, you naturally have more time to fill. And Tom and I, through our years of doing album reviews, the 800 plus album reviews, we often argued that you really need to assess the listening experience.
Yeah.
Every song needs to add value to the cohesive listening experience. We want to be able to press play at the beginning of an album and not have to skip a track until the very end, the last second rings out. And that is the goal of a great album. If you look at all the great albums through time, they usually don't have any filler tracks or any tracks that are just overwhelmingly weaker than the other. That's just a general theme we've discovered. So when you have a longer album, it obviously increases the risk that you're you're going to have one or two duds
Right.
on that album, and especially if the double album is usually because you're trying to just do the shotgun blast of different styles and usually a bit more adventurous too, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there is an inherent risk there because if you have a weaker track, it could really break up the listening experience and make the album less relatable, less listenable. And in Arcade Fire's case with Reflector, that certainly was the case. There was a number of tracks that we found were weak. I know that we are a bit cooler on that album than a lot of other people were. But this is pretty common with a lot of double albums. Spoiler alert. Let's address Led Zeppelin's 6th album, Physical Graffiti, which was a double album. That did not make our top 10. It's an honorable mention. We both
still like it. Yeah.
Both really still like that album, but there's a number of tracks on that album that aren't the masterpieces of the previous 5 albums Led Zeppelin did that I would consider, lesser or weaker tracks. And I think that takes away from the cohesive masterpiece that you're used to and definitely makes it a harder listen to straight through. So the artists who can put out a double album, a really long album, and have every single track still kick ass. That is an impressive feat.
It is.
And really, really a very rare accomplishment.
It's naturally a very high risk, high reward way of doing music, because one thing that I want to come back to that you mentioned, Jake, is you have this idea of, we talked about this during our album reviews all the time, that even with a single album, it's a difficult feat to have balance when crafting a record. Like I said, not even necessarily a double record, where you have a good balance between variety and consistency. Because you don't want to feel like you're listening to the same 10 or 12 tracks over and over again.
Right.
But you also don't want to feel like there's such a disconnect in the style that you can't make a cohesive listening experience. A double album, to me, just effectively doubles the difficulty of achieving something like that. Because since there's so much more content, naturally, either there has to be more variety to make it worthwhile, or there just has to be more quality content. But even if the content is quality on a track-by-track basis, chances are if you've got a 20-track album, by the time you get to track 15, you're going to be bored with it if it's too repetitive.
Right. Are you ready to dive into the list, Tom?
I'm ready.
Let's do it.
All right.
So, Tom, what album... So first, let's back up and talk about how we compose these lists. As we've done lists in the past, Tom and I each come up with our own lists, and then we rank them. Like we picked 30 double albums here. Keep in mind we're only going to cover 10 on the podcast, but we ranked 30 double albums, and then we combine that list and then assign a point value. Kind of 30 minus however many, and then that's how many points you get for the album, and then sum those together. So it really is an average of what our favorite albums
It's not actually reflective of either of our individual lists, but it's pretty close, and that's the point.
But we've had success with this model because, we've always come away with it going, yeah, that looks pretty good. That's about right. I'm fine with this list.
Yeah, you find a good compromise, a good middle ground.
So that this is our combined favorite double albums list here.
One quick disclaimer before we dive into the list too is that this list does not include live albums or any kind of like greatest hits compilations thing like that. This is purely studio double albums.
Yes, albums that the artist tried to create to be studio works. So let's start. Number 10, Tom, is
Miles Davis, Bitches Brew.
Bitches Brew. Now, have we talked about Bitches Brew as Velocities in Music before?
I don't even know if you and I have much individually, to be honest.
Really?
Not much.
Really?
Yeah.
I love Bitches Brew.
Yeah.
This has been an album that I have really been invested in since I think my senior year of high school. So would have been like early to mid 2000s that I was really getting into this.
You were
record.
a little ahead of me on that because I wasn't really big into jazz. I mean, you and I were in jazz band together in high school. We've listened to jazz a lot.
Push our glasses up, Tom.
Yeah. But I really feel like I just started diving into jazz a lot more and have a deeper appreciation for it over the last 3 or 4 years probably. Right. And Bitches Brew is one I always come back to.
Now, this was an album that really kind of changed the course of jazz music. It came out in April of 1970. This was Miles Davis was already a very, very well-established jazz musician at this point in time. In fact, he was a legend by 1970. So for him to come along, release a double album that changed the world of jazz music forever, and really kick off a whole new genre is legendary just by itself. But considering how good this album is, it's pretty mind-blowing. This album, Bitches Brew, really solidified the genre known as jazz, rock, or fusion.
Yeah.
And you're going to see throughout the rest of this list a number of other references to this genre that probably those albums wouldn't have had the sound that they did had Miles Davis's Bitches Brew never been released.
Right.
And I find that makes this a really special listen.
It is. And Miles Davis, to me, he dominated 3 consecutive decades of music, the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Right.
And he changed the game several different times. And actually, this is kind of a tangent. This could be a podcast in itself, Jake, but I see Miles Davis as the single most important and influential figure in music history. Because his music, that's a bold...
Mozart?
That's a bold statement.
Mozart?
Okay, in 20th century, like contemporary music. I'll say that.
I'll bookend it a little bit.
We can find some Gregorian monk that influenced music more than anyone if we want to really
the
want
man
to.
who invented the piano.
Right.
Or woman. I'm actually not sure who invented the piano.
I don't know. We can look into that. But Miles Davis, the thing about him is his music changed so much, and he didn't just influence the jazz genre.
Right.
He influenced rock, he influenced fusion, and some would argue created fusion.
Right.
I mean, so many areas of music, and to me, Bitches Brew is the peak of that. You know, before that, he had albums like In a Silent Way and Sketches of Spain, which still dabbled in some different genres. And then Bitches Brew happened. After that, he had, like On the Corner and a tribute to Jack Johnson, which got more into kind of rock music, actually. But Bitches Brew, to me, is just like this huge left turn, just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And
very
it's
spacey, moody sound.
It's crazy.
Sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi film. And you have trumpets and other horns and keys like you've never really heard them before. A lot of saxophone too. And it's hard to describe because it's so contorted sounding. And very rhythmic.
Yeah, the thing to me that's a highlight is the guitar. John McLaughlin's guitar playing. There's even a track named after the guitar.
And that's
track.
why it's fusion, right?
Right,
is
exactly.
that guitar. But the killer thing to me, the killer quality of Bitches Brew, and really fundamentally why it's on this list is that even today in 2015, we're almost at the end of 2015 when we're recording this, and it still sounds fresh, even futuristic.
Yeah.
It still sounds like it's ahead of its time in 2015.
And this was 45 years ago.
45 years ago. This came out. I mean, that is such a feat that it's really quite impressive. All right, Tom, number 9 on our list. Favorite double album number 9 is 9 Inch Nails' The Fragile.
Oh, yes.
Fragile.
A very divisive album amongst 9 Inch Nails
This
fans.
is kind of a controversial pick for us.
It is, because a lot of people hate this album.
It's not my favorite 9 Inch Nails album, that's for sure.
Well, me neither. It's actually probably like my 3rd favorite. I would put Pretty Hate Machine above it as well as the Downward Spiral. That's a fair point.
Maybe even The Slip.
I do love Year Zero.
Yeah.
So the thing about The Fragile, as many people as I know who hate it, I know just as many who it's their favorite.
Yeah.
And I think that just goes to what I was saying about the high risk, high reward nature of double albums. It will either resonate with people or it won't. Maybe even resonate with people or it won't. I had to slip that in. Wow. Now that I actually said that joke, I realized how terrible it was.
That's like Jake caliber of joke right there. Like I'm impressed. We've clearly been hanging out a lot.
But the thing about The Fragile is I think the reason it stands out to me, even if it's not 9 Inch Nails' best work, or even up there for some of us mega fans of the group.
Which, admittedly, we totally
right,
are.
we totally are, but it's such a unique piece of work, and it's something that over the course of a double album, still, on the rest of Trent's expansive career, I don't think that he really copies anything from it.
Yeah.
He's starting to, on this album, it actually, to me, feels a little bit poppier, just with the way that he's making vocal melody a little bit more front and center.
Yep. And a lot of that's in the production.
Right, a lot of that's in the production as well. The production's a little sharper, and where on like the Broken EP and the Downward Spiral, you had a lot of those industrial elements. They were much grittier on those.
Yep.
You still have the dirty industrial stuff on the Fragile, but it's much more cleanly produced.
Right. This is definitely rooted in the same type of sound that Reznor was presenting on the Downward Spiral, which, by the way, came out in 1994, Tom's favorite year of music, or one of your favorite years of music.
Definitely.
This came out September 1999. So 5 years in between these albums, so it's kind of cool that he put out a double album. But like, what really comes out to me is that you have a lot of huge layered sounds, walls of distorted guitar, and really where the change happened for me is these kind of nightmarish electronic flutters and rhythms, and even more like ambient atmospheric keyboards that come in. I would say that the vocals, and probably because of all the stuff you were saying, Tom, in the production, they don't have the bite that they did on the Downward Spiral.
They don't. They're almost a little smoother. Even where they're meant to be edgy on an individual level, you put them all together in the mix and they make this smooth experience. But another trademark of this album is the time that he takes with these kind of instrumental interludes between tracks.
Yes.
Songs like Complication, Mark Has Been Made. It to me, just like, I look forward to those tracks.
Right.
It's not all just about Trent's vocals on this album.
Sure. And the other thing with this record, and probably why it's not one of my more favorite Nine Inch Nails albums, but I still love it overall, is there's kind of inherently track displacement, that whole risk-reward of the double album. You know, a number of the tracks here are some of my favorite Nine Inch Nails tracks, like The Wretched, for sure. Track 11 on disc 1, La Mer.
That's one I wanted to highlight too.
I absolutely love that track.
It's actually my favorite song on the record, and it doesn't even really have vocals. It's just this instrumental bit. So, starts with this kind of stumbling 3/4 piano piece, and then the 4/4 drums come in. You get this kind of polyrhythm, and then you get the bass line that will then be reprised on Into the Void a few tracks later in the beginning of disc 2, or right as it's referred to, left and
disc.
right.
Good call. I was calling it disc 1. It's actually left disc.
Right. Part of the whole experience he's trying to put together. But to me, little moments like that is what creates the consistency, and having those ties between the first half and the second half of a double album like this helps to justify it. But I have to agree with you, Jake. There are some weaker tracks on here. It is not a perfect album, but at the same time, I think that if he had tried to trim it down to one record, I don't think it would have worked as well.
Right. As we wrap up Nine Inch Nails' The Fragile on our favorite double albums list, I just want to comment on the fact of like where Tom and I record these podcasts in Tom's homemade studio, and he has the walls absolutely plastered in different musical photos. And as in posters, as Tom has been talking about Nine Inch Nails, that he has a picture of Trent Reznor playing a guitar, and Trent's kind of looking up, and he's looking directly at Tom, like glaring at him. Ominously as
I
Tom.
noticed that. I'm glad it's out of sight. It would have freaked me out.
As Tom is like talking about Trent's music, Trent's staring at him. It's interesting. All right, next up is Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Now, Tom, give us a description. This album came out in 1994, one of the best years in music, and it really, to me, is truly an ambient record.
It is. It's funny coming off of Aphex Twin's 1992 debut, Selected Ambient Works Volume 1, which then it has years associated at like 1985 through 1992, basically just a compilation of things that Richard James had been putting together over the, previous years. The thing about Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 is it's truly ambient. Volume 1 represented much more of the actual, like, kind of electronica of the time. Still very forward-thinking, very well-written, classic analog sound. And then Volume 2 just takes it off the deep end. 2.5 hour long album of truly ambient work.
Each of the tracks are titled by number,
just a number.
And then whatever they are.
No words associated with them. And it's just, to me, it's one of the most otherworldly experiences listening to this album.
I took some notes on what we're going to say about each of these records, and you've literally just crossed all the bullet points I had on this album. I've only recently got into Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Tom has been yelling at me for years to listen to this record, and I just haven't, because it's daunting. You look at it, it is. A ton of music.
Some other time. Yeah.
And it's going to be a mood bomb, and so I've put it off, but I've lately been, running around at night playing Ingress, and this is the perfect record for that. And so I've listened to this a lot in recent weeks, and I've absolutely fallen in love with this record, and really just can't turn it off.
No,
it's perfect.
It's addictive, and it's funny because you finish listening to it and you just want to start it again.
Absolutely.
Because it's been so damn long since you've
Yeah.
listened to the first track,
Yeah.
which the first track to me is one of the best.
Yep.
And it's funny how he creates these soundscapes that can go on for upwards of 7, 8, 12 minutes.
And they never get dull.
And you don't get sick of it.
Right.
And it's very minimal changes,
Yeah.
very, very just slight like moves in the music that you pick up on very subtly and subconsciously that just make it so you just get hypnotized by it. You just get
Absolutely.
engrossed in this experience. And it's just something that even with all the other ambient music and mood-based music I've listened to, I've never heard anything that achieves what Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 does in that regard. All right, moving from Aphex Twin on to number 7, George Harrison, All Things Must Pass.
They shall. All things must.
That's true. This album is just, it's all about songwriting. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, it's just George Harrison pumping out some of his best work.
Yeah, it came out, it's his first solo record. It came out in November of 1970, so right as the Beatles have truly just ended as a
Right.
band. The world is mourning the loss of the Beatles breaking up. The everyone's favorite band, and probably still favorite band. They had in 1968 the White Album came out. 1969
Abbey Road.
and then in 1970 Let It Be was released, even though it was recorded a couple years prior. George Harrison, All Things Must Pass was first of all, it was originally intended to be a triple album, which really you could even debate why should it even be considered on our double albums list or as a double
That's
album.
true. Double album or more. I think
But-
that we should.
Yeah,
clear that up.
but the thing is that the third disc here is called the Apple Jam, and it's really just a bunch of jam sessions that George had done, among with other musicians. But really, like what makes up All Things Must Pass is its unused composition from George's time with the Beatles. And when you listen to it and you think to yourself, shit, all these songs were rejected from Beatles records? Like,
Right.
These are great songs.
Well, and it's funny because the White Album was the album that featured the most George Harrison
for sure.
songs at like 5. There were like of however many songs were on the White Album, like 33 or something. 5 of them were George's. And then he pumps out this collection of songs and they're all just so good. And really when you think about it, after the Beatles broke up, I think if they had continued, really what it would have been is just a collection of the songs that we heard from their early solo material.
And as the
only
Beatles,
slightly modified.
and actually, like this is as close as we come. Well, I guess besides Paul McCartney's Ram, this is probably one of the closest albums we've come to actually talking about the Beatles as Velocities of music, Tom. And you're absolutely right with what you said before. Like, what makes this album great is that really every song on it is fantastic, and it's because of songwriting. Really grand, complex, sweeping arrangements with tons of melody. I would say that it definitely still retains that Beatlesque sound.
It does.
But that's because it was written during the Beatle era, but as George composed this, it's produced by Phil Spector, so it has kind of that grand production sound, and it really kind of serves as a Beatles sound. Like the Beatles after the Beatles, right? And there's a number, like all the Beatles, as they released their solo albums after the band broke up, had still a Beatlesque sound. Probably least so John Lennon, but he was the quintessential, voice of the Beatles. He and Paul. So it really still carries that torch forward.
Right. There's just no gimmicks here. There's nothing too fancy. You mentioned the production, definitely. It's kind of big and grand, but the songs are just good. I don't know what else more to say about it. Just listen to this album.
This is probably one of the most consistent albums on our double albums list, where it's so hard to write a double album or even a triple album in this case that's this consistent. And George Harrison, because he's a genius, musical genius, he just knocks it out of the park.
Everyone has choice when to not to raise their voice. Each other decides. while feeling
All right, number 6 on our list is an album that I've actually struggled with over the years. The Smashing Pumpkins, Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness.
Yeah.
Smashing Pumpkins released this in October of 1995, and I will go on the record as saying I think this is simply one of the best rock albums ever made. Simply one of the best records
It is
ever
truly
made.
epic. And
It is.
I'm
in
not
every
just
sense of the
using
word.
that phrase colloquially as our generation tends to overuse it. I mean, this album truly is. It's huge, it's sprawling, and you don't hear, a lot of successful double albums in this just kind of classic hard rock vein.
Right.
Because typically it's a genre that gets tiresome. I think that where Smashing Pumpkins make it really successful is in the variety. They kick it off with this gorgeous piano ballad and then move into Tonight Tonight, which is just a staple of 90s rock. And right from the get-go there, coming off of Gish and Siamese Dream, what a change that is, because it's so much more heartfelt. You listen to a song like Tonight Tonight and it's like, wow, these are the guys who did Cherub Rock,
Right.
Like it's a totally different sound. Not that they hadn't done some kind of softer stuff in the past, but the emotional level they take it to is way beyond on this album. Another thing that they do is they get heavier even still at times. They really run the full gamut of their sound. There are some tracks on here that just feel all out metal. Bullet with Butterfly Wings, classic track from the 90s, once again, a huge single from this album. He's just screaming at you, and the fact that was, a good thing for alternative radio and something that people were into, it really was actually heavier than a lot of stuff that was popular at the time.
There's also a couple of very experimental tracks on this record, and it really shows the variety that Billy Corgan and Smashing Pumpkins put together. Tracks like Love and Beautiful, I think, use a lot of even electronic textures at times. And for the mid-90s, that was pretty out there.
Yeah.
You were just starting to see artists incorporate more of those elements.
Especially from a rock band.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, there were electronic artists, but you didn't really have this duality of like a guitar band incorporating that.
And for as expansive as this album was, and the sounds and the different styles that they were presenting on this album, what always brings it back to center, and why I have fallen in love with this album over the years, is it always comes back to that quintessential 1990s grunge guitar melodies, which are just fantastic throughout Smashing Pumpkins' discography. And also Billy Corgan, while I've never been a huge fan of his voice, it is an acquired taste, and I'm certainly becoming more of a fan of it. His vocal melodies are just out of this world, and that is songwriting talent. Right
his
there.
writing is terrific, and I would never ever fault someone for not liking his voice. That's totally fair, but. Right. At the same time, you can't imagine it being any other way, because the way that his voice is, as imperfect and as cracked as it is, he conveys the emotion in the writing so perfectly. He knows how to deliver his own message and use his kind of odd, quirky voice to its fullest extent. This is an album that is tough to swallow because it is long. It's I believe over 2 hours long.
It is, and it's so confrontational at times. Bullet with Butterfly Wings, you mentioned that song before. I think that's one of the best rock songs ever written. I absolutely love that song. I can listen to it over and over again. It gets stuck in my head, and that's the mark of a great rock song. And really, more so than a lot of other songs that were coming out in the mid-90s, I think captured a generation and made a statement. I love that track, and there's just so many tracks on this album that I love. But I would say that that's a good disclaimer, Tom. If you put this album on, you really have to set aside time and devote yourself to getting through it. And then once you get through it once, maybe even 2 or 3 times, is when you start to see the bigger picture and you see the mastermind and the masterpiece that this album really is when you walk away from it.
And it's funny because they even wrote way more content than they included.
Yes.
They pared it down to be a double album. They wrote like twice as much as what's actually there, which is just insane to me.
We really need to do a deep dive on Smashing Pumpkins.
That would be fun.
It would be a fun one.
All right, so we're cracking into the top 5 now, and at number 5, we've got Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde.
Blonde on Blonde. What an evocative album title.
Right. I love it. This album was actually tough for me to get into because it was actually the first Bob Dylan album that I ever purchased. I purchased it on CD when I was, I think, like a freshman in college, and I just wanted.
Didn't you used to not like
I didn't.
Bob Dylan?
I absolutely used to not like Bob Dylan.
What's wrong with you?
And really, I just think that this for me was not a very good entry point because I was like,
Probably not.
I was like, this is just a long album of the same kind of sounding like bluesy, folksy rock, and I just don't care. Then once I came back to it after having listened to. Bringing it all back home, Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, some of that even earlier stuff of his that I really like now. I gave Blonde on Blonde another shot, and I realized, once again, similar to what we said about All Things Must Pass, it's just about the songwriting. Yep. And what he accomplishes here with a more full band sound, which is something relatively new for him. He had put out several albums before this, but I mean, this was 1966. He'd only been around since the early 60s, really a few years. Mm-hmm. And he was already just changing his sound and maturing his songwriting to an extent that to me is just unprecedented and really amazing.
Yeah, and one of the conduits in which I think one has to connect with Bob Dylan's music to really fully appreciate it and dive into it is just getting into his lyrics. The focus and this is true of most Dylan albums, but especially on Blonde on Blonde, the focus of the sound is on Dylan's lyrics. There's a lot of crunchy guitars and his signature harmonica, and as Tom mentioned, that full band sound. This really blends a lot of different styles from like folk to blues and country. But to me, this album, Blonde on Blonde, and Highway 61 Revisited, which is the album that came out prior to this, those are like my two go-to Dylan albums. Like, there's a lot of other great ones, but these are my two go-to, and I absolutely love Blonde on Blonde.
Yeah.
Sooner or later, one of us must know that you just did what you're supposed to do. Sooner or later, one of us must know that I really did try to.
Next up, at number 4, we have Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life. This album came out in September of 1976, and I will say this is one of the most expansive albums on our favorite double albums list. This goes all over the place. R&B, fusion rock, prog, big band jazz with the tribute to Duke Ellington.
Soul, funk,
absolutely,
everything.
Yep.
And Stevie Wonder, to me, he just jumps out there and just gives his songwriting dominance. I mean, this guy is a force to be reckoned with.
He really is.
And so I actually got to see him play this album all the way through last November, almost exactly a year ago. I saw that he was coming through Chicago playing it, and I was like, I have to go to this. And wow, it was incredible. And even in his 60s now, the guy has still got it. And that's something to keep in mind, too. I mean, when this album came out, when he was recording it, he was like 25 years old.
Right.
He was like my age. Like, what am I doing with my life, Jake?
What are you
Come
doing?
on.
Why are you talking to me through a microphone in your home?
I'm not writing masterpieces like this.
I disagree.
But the guy was already an established artist by that point. I mean, he just went off the deep end for this one. And I've heard stories that he would keep people going in the studio for 20 plus hours at a time, just saying, if I'm in the mood, I expect people to keep up with me. And I think that just right there captures Stevie Wonder's energy, but it's also a positive energy. This album to me is like a spiritual healing experience. Like, you listen to it and it gets you right at your soul. And I can't say enough good things about it. But let's actually dig into the songs and the structure a little bit, because there are some really expansive tracks on here, which for this genre at the time was really pretty different, especially when you get to the second half of the album and some of the very last tracks. They go on and on and on. But for me, once again, it's an experience that I don't get sick of. He's also tackling a lot of social issues, which really started to happen with some of his early to mid 70s material on tracks like Black Man, on tracks like Pastime Paradise, Village Ghetto Land. He's really trying to make a statement with this, and yet somehow he can transition from tracks like that to just the very upbeat Sir Duke, or one of my favorite love songs of all time, Knocks Me Off My Feet. Absolutely great song.
Tom sings that song to me all the time.
Right, you wish. But just track after track, I mean, I can't get enough of this one. I think it's an absolute masterpiece.
Every single track on this record is excellent and memorable, and
Yeah.
I think that is like we said earlier. This is one of the qualities of just a masterpiece double album. This is one of the best records of all time. I think pretty much everyone considers it to be one of the best records of all time. But also as a double album, to have every single track be at this level of quality really shows Stevie Wonder's just masterful mind when it comes to songwriting, and his work ethic, as Tom was referring to earlier.
Just because the record has a groove, don't make it in the groove. But you can tell right away it's Dr. A when the people start to move. They can feel it all over. They can feel it all over.
All right, number 3, we've got Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Wow. This album, it's one of those double albums that he's really going for variety. He's really shooting for the moon, too, because he's biting off a lot. I mean, you've got your kind of classic Elton John piano ballads. You've got your kind of rockin' tracks with Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting. You've even got Jamaican Jerk Off, which is kind of like a reggae-inspired tune from their experience in Jamaica, which was short-lived and not very positive, as Elton John tells the story. But this is, it's not really an overly themed or conceptual album. It's just Elton John had so many tracks that he wanted to put together and include on this, and somehow he made it work because it's just that good. And one thing I gotta say is the balls it takes to kick off a double album with like an 11-minute track, Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding, and that track just sets the stage for the rest of the album.
Have I told you the story that my dad has forced me? Well, he's told me this throughout my life, that when he dies, he wants Funeral for a Friend played in its entirety at his funeral.
That's
so
good.
like as his casket's being lowered into the ground, you're gonna hear Love Lives Bleeding.
And oh man, when that first electric guitar line comes in, it's just perfect.
And that really is a good point. This album came out in October 1973. It's really at the peak of Elton John's his rock movement of his career, right? This guy got, in my opinion, he got a little bit sappier, a lot more of like the love song, pop songs later on in his career, and I think that his just the overall listenability of his albums went down. But this album through and through is just a masterpiece. You have huge classic rock guitar, tons of melodies, and Elton John, his voice back in this era was so spot on, and he wrote so many great vocal melodies, but more importantly, he had genius choruses that are timeless. And even today, when you listen to Elton John's music, especially the music from Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and this era of Elton John, it's just mind-blowing, just absolutely fantastic songwriting. The song Benny and the Jets, like when that song comes on, I cannot stop listening to Benny and the Jets. I will scream, I will yell out and sing it as loud as I can.
Yeah, and while with Benny and the Jets, Candle in the Wind, the title track of the album, big radio hits, big, classic tracks that you still hear about today, some of the more unknown tracks from this album are still highlights to me, like Gray Seal is one that I love. Just so much variety on this one that you listen through it and you're like, this is not even fair. Like, how does someone make an album this good and this thorough?
Number 2, we have one of the most strangest albums you could possibly put on a favorite double albums list, but I gotta say, this is one of the records that Tom introduced me to that has completely changed how I perceive music and what I define as music and what I define as great music. We have Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica.
Oh, yeah. Just you saying it makes me want to listen to it.
I know, right? This album, first of all, we reviewed this a long time ago, Tom, as one of our throwback reviews. Came out in 1969. It's one of the most completely unique albums ever written. As with a lot of Beefheart's sound, it was something notable is that it was produced by Frank Zappa.
Yep.
And in Frank Zappa, who as we're number 2 on this list. Frank Zappa, his album Freak Out is not on our top 10 list, but it is on our overall list.
Yes.
But this album is so hard to describe the sound.
It is.
Tom, will you take a stab at it?
I'll try. This is one that I feel like we're never going to be able to do it justice.
No.
Just kind of skimming through it on a best of list like this, because we could spend 2 hours talking about the sound and the history on this album. But at its core, to me, it's avant-garde experimental blues with some jazz,
rock,
right?
Married to that jazz infusion,
right?
That that we were talking about back on album number 10 on our list, "Bitches Brew" by Miles Davis.
But Captain Beefheart himself has a very bluesy, howlin' wolf type voice.
Yep.
But the instrumentals are just batshit crazy on this album.
Batshit crazy is a great way to describe it.
This is a very challenging listen, and the first time that you listen to it, you will absolutely think like. These guys have no idea what they're doing.
Erratic melodies, very
Right.
complicated rhythms.
Right.
It honestly comes off the first time you hear it sounds sloppy and unprofessional.
Yes, it absolutely does. And it's funny because the more and more you listen to it, with every time, it starts to make sense in your head to the point where I've listened to this album so many times, it just doesn't even sound weird to me anymore.
No.
It just sounds like a very advanced blues record.
Right.
But what he does with the writing and the rhythms and the guitar and bass interplay, it sounds like it doesn't make sense. But then once you understand his vision for it, and once you hear all the intricacies and get to know the album well enough, you couldn't imagine one drum hit being anywhere else.
No.
It all had to be exactly how it was. And that was Captain Beefheart's vision for it. He was a slave driver on his band, very hard on his band to get these things perfect because he knew it had to be that way. And to me, that is visionary and genius on a level that I can't even comprehend.
I saw you, baby, dancing in your X-ray gingham dress. I knew you were under duress. I knew you under your dress.
If you haven't listened to Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask Replica, you need to set aside some time, know that it will be painful at first, and force yourself to do it. It is a listening experience that everyone needs to be exposed to. And Tom and I will definitely say, this album is not for everyone.
No.
We love it, but our wives hate it.
And I can't listen to it when Kelsey's around.
Neither can I. And I will actually get told to turn it off, which rarely happens. My wife has great taste in music. It's one of the reasons why I fell in love with her, right? But Trout Mask Replica is not one of the albums we can listen to together.
That's where you draw the line.
So listen to this. Make sure that you probably should be alone because other people probably aren't going to be of the same mindset as you are when you put it on. It's just an album that you got to give a few chances, and I think that if you can see some and hear some of the underlying melody and the complexity that some of these songs present and this album presents as a whole, I think that you will derive at least some value from it and appreciate it. It might not be your favorite album ever. It is one of Tom and my favorite albums of all time. But it's certainly worth your time to go through it a few times.
And there's absolutely nothing else like it. You won't get this experience anywhere else.
And probably never will be ever again unless someone's copying this verbatim.
Right.
Light on Vermont, affected everybody, even Mrs. Wooden Wellers, little nitty, even Lifeboy floating with his little pistols showing.
One artist that Tom and I have always wanted to review on Velocities of Music, to some extent, but never have, is the Beatles. And for the number one album on our favorite double album list of all time, we have the Beatles' White Album.
Yep.
Came out in November of 1968, towards the very end of the Beatles, really as the band was starting to fall apart.
Yeah.
I think Yoko was in the studio at this point in time. That you really hear in the track listing, these guys are clearly not working together.
No, it's very disconnected.
It's really a compilation of a bunch of singles from the members of the Beatles.
Yeah.
Even Ringo has his first self-written song on this album, and that might not be perfectly accurate. Just bear with me here, but I think That's Don't Pass Me By.
Yeah, Don't Pass Me By.
Which is just a fantastic song.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier when we were covering All Things Must Pass, George Harrison's first and his double album that made this list, that he has 5 tracks on this album, but it's really quite an expansive record.
It is. Yeah. To me, I can summarize why I think this album is brilliant in really kind of one assessment. And that's the fact that there are so many tracks on here, and yet it manages to never retrace its steps.
True.
It never copies itself. Every single track, like, I can't pull one song and say, here's another song that does the same thing, that accomplishes the same thing.
Really over their entire discography.
Right. And within this album itself even, I mean, just it's such a unique work. There's a lot of experimentation, but then there's also just a lot of no-nonsense, great rock songwriting. A lot of good ballads. You have Blackbird, you have Julia and I Will.
Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life you were only waiting for this moment to arise.
Is still, even the simple ballad-esque tracks, they don't sound too similar. I mean, what these guys put together on this album just amazes me. And, you know, there's a lot of talk even within the group. I think, like, George Harrison had said, like, yeah, I think we probably could have skimmed it down to one record. Whereas Paul's like, no, it's the Beatles' White Album.
Right.
It's great. Just leave it as it is. And I have to agree with Paul on that one. I can't imagine this album any other way. When I start it, I just want to listen to it all the way through, because even while some tracks are stronger than others, I have my favorites. The key to a good album, and especially in a double album, like I said, is that even if there are some tracks you don't like as much, if their goal, what they're doing, is not already being accomplished by another track, then they are contributing to the overall experience. And I think every song does that on here, even Wild Honey Pie.
Which is a genius little fun song.
Right, a little interlude between tracks. I mean, and with how disconnected and really unrelated all the tracks are, the way that they're able to make it flow and still feel like a cohesive statement is mind-blowing. I don't think anything else like it has been done.
And I think that another part of the masterpiece that is the White Album that we have to kind of observe when you listen to this is that, you know, the band, thinking about, and this is something we didn't do as well when we were doing album reviews, Tom, but now, like, reflecting on the Beatles' discography and the Beatles' career as just, if not one of the, but if not the most appreciated and loved, and not, if not best, rock bands of all time, is the band, as they started to kind of splinter apart, you know, this album is so reflective, and so it tells so much of a story about the Beatles and who they were and where they were going as musicians at this point. This is really kind of the climactic point of the Beatles' career. Never again are you gonna have a true Beatles album, because, you know, Let It Be, it was you know, very much a post-produced record.
Yeah.
And you know, they took skeletons of songs and tried to make a record out of it after the Beatles were essentially done. And Abbey Road was done, you know, significant part of Abbey Road was done without John Lennon there. So it was very difficult. I think this is really the last full Beatles experience that you have. One of the things I want to do, I want to quote a review that I read on this album from AllMusic. Yes, Tom and I read other music reviews. It's part of how we get better at doing this, I think, over time. My favorite album reviewer at AllMusic, Stephen Thomas Erlewine, he said, "Never before had a rock record been so self-reflective or so ironic." And I think that that really sums up the quintessential essence of the White Album. It tells the story of where the Beatles came from and where they were going after you know, they were meet their demise and break up and go on their solo careers.
It's like a caricature of themselves, almost.
It's romantic.
Yeah.
There's something about this record that it just has this magical quality to it. And in addition to the fact that every single song is memorable, even the one song that I think really does kind of hurt the listening experience, which is
Revolution 9.
But it's very memorable. Like how many times can number 9?
Number 9.
Number 9.
I mean, every time. I mean, Jake, when you introduced 9 Inch Nails The Fragile as number 9 on this list, in my head I was going, number 9?
Yeah, you can't
9.
avoid it.
Yeah.
And so that even the weakest song on this record is that memorable. That's special. That's special. You don't get this every day. And this, I admittedly, Tom, this is usually the number one pick on the best double albums list. If you Google best double albums of all time, it's usually the White Album.
And I think that's for a good reason.
It's for a good reason. We can't argue with that, and we agree. Overall, we agree with it for all the reasons that we stated. So that concludes our top 10 favorite double albums of all time lists here at Velocities of Music. Now, I'm betting that a lot of you are thinking, well, what about this album? What about this album? How can you guys overlook this album? We're going to list, if you're watching this, we post these as videos on YouTube and our YouTube channel. If you're watching there, you'll see a list there, and there's also a page at velocitiesandmusic.com, our website, where we'll post this podcast and have our comprehensive list there. But just to cover some honorable mentions that were very close to the top but didn't make our list, and then just other albums that we think deserve to be mentioned. We mentioned Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti before we kicked the list off. That is a record that Tom and I both love, but just wasn't quite, we didn't love it enough that it actually made the list. It was number 14 overall.
Yeah. A couple that I want to point out that I think people are really going to be upset are not on there. Actually, a few. Probably top 3 I bet we get flack for, Jake, are Pink Floyd's The Wall.
Ooh, yeah, definitely.
Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street.
I love that album.
And The Clash's London Calling.
Yep.
All those 3 right now, right there, are typically included in best of albums list, even when you're not just talking about double albums, when you're just talking about albums in general. And don't get me wrong, I like all 3 of those albums. For me, though, they're not ones that I come back to a lot. I was making my list, I don't know about you, Jake, I was making mine based a lot on comeback quality.
Absolutely.
And for Pink Floyd, while I like select tracks from The Wall, I don't find myself coming back to it because it's just a little intimidating, and I find myself liking their 5 or 6 track albums better, like Wish You Were Here or Animals.
I don't want this to turn into a Pink Floyd review, but I've never been a fan of The Wall. I like a few tracks on it, and I just think it's hugely overrated.
I actually completely agree. For me, the other 2 I want to kind of lump together, The Clash's London Calling and Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. And while I like both those albums, I actually listened to them in preparation for this just to see if, maybe I should bump them up a bit on my list. But what it comes down to for me is that while I know I've listened to those albums enough to really know them well, I still just don't come off of them feeling very memorable. When I want to listen to the Rolling Stones, I don't think to go to that record. I go to Sticky Fingers, Let It Bleed, or Beggar's Banquet.
Good call.
Same thing with The Clash. I actually find myself drawn to their self-titled album and Sandinista more than I'm drawn to London Calling.
Which Sandinista is also on this list.
Right. Sandinista I actually placed a little bit higher than London Calling. But those are all classic records. I'd still strongly recommend them, but they're not quite in the top 10 for me.
I'd throw Derek and the Dominoes, Layla, and other assorted love songs in that list too. Also, we have 2 albums by The Who on our list, Tommy and then Quadrophenia, which are both fantastic.
Yeah, and those are pretty. I think if we did top 20, they would both be on there.
Absolutely.
Those 2 are great.
A couple of more modern albums, more recent albums that are on our list. Number 11 was Baroness Yellow and Green.
I still can't get enough of that
which we
one.
reviewed and cannot stop listening to since it came out a few years ago. LCD Sound System, self-titled record.
Swans have had 2, The Seer and To Be Kind.
Yep, absolutely.
And actually, one of their older records, Soundtracks for the Blind, was a double album too. It's funny, these bands who have multiple double albums, like they just can't pump out content quickly enough, like back-to-back double albums.
And we also had a post-rock appearance too later on in the list. Godspeed You Black Emperors, Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. Absolutely masterful.
Terrific album. Yep. Modern masterpiece there. Aphex Twin even had another one with, is it Drug Cues? I don't know how to pronounce it. Drugs. I do drugs.
You say it better when you're intoxicated.
Yeah, you say it better when you're on drugs, probably.
So, Tom, is this an all-inclusive list?
I mean, I don't think it can be. There are a lot of double albums out there, but it's funny because when I was preparing for this, I wasn't really sure what to expect. And I'd started by just making as inclusive of a list of double albums that I'd listened to as I possibly could. And I realized, like, wow, I've listened to a lot of double albums, but actually there aren't as many out there as I thought. So there are a lot of lesser known ones that are being released all the time, and those are hard to keep track of. And I was kind of trying to think of the ones that are notable to me and notable to the general musical canon, have been influential, have garnered a lot of critical acclaim. That's the kind of stuff that I'm looking for. And then once I put this together, I'm like, making my top 30 or so is pretty easy, but narrowing it down to like 10 is pretty tough, because there's just a lot of good stuff out there.
That was difficult, but also very fun. Question I have for you, Tom. Why is Bruce Springsteen's The River not on this list?
Because I don't like Bruce Springsteen.
Tom.
That's the short answer.
He's the boss.
No, Tony Danza is the boss.
Oh, no.
Come on.
Hold me closer, Tony Danza.
If Bruce Springsteen is the boss, then I quit. I don't want to work here anymore. That's...
we do this for fun, right?
Yeah. Okay. I just mean in general. Whatever he's the boss of, no. I don't want to
quit whatever that is.
Right. I'm just not a fan. And actually, The River and some of that era of Springsteen, I actually like a lot better than some of his more acclaimed 70s work.
I would agree with that.
But still, man, like a Bruce Springsteen triple album, I can't do it.
So out of this list that we've compiled here, Tom, what are some consistencies that we see in great double albums? As I was going through it, one word that I kept running into, that I found myself saying and that I was reading others say, was overwhelming.
Yeah.
Double albums, good double albums, that is, seem to be overwhelming.
Yeah.
They seem to be challenging to listen to and to get into the first time, probably because of their scale. There's just so many tracks to go through, but also because of their reach as well.
Yeah.
They're so expansive and so forward-thinking and self-indulgent, for that matter.
Definitely self-indulgent, because it's basically an artist saying, you know what? I think that you should have to listen to this much of me, like twice as much as you normally would. You're going to have to do that. And like, it's definitely self-indulgent, but I think it's just about being able to, first off, I should just say, I don't think that self-indulgence is a qualitatively negative thing all the time.
Right.
If you can find a way to make it relate to your listener, that's fine. If you're doing it just for yourself and you don't really care if people are able to connect with it, then probably people won't like it. But another quality that I find is I think that it lends itself well to concept albums in general. If you're trying to tell a story, sometimes it provides some more of that warrant. But actually, I'll say, most of our top 10 weren't that way.
No.
I think that there's a larger thematic vision that doesn't necessarily come to a narrative storyline or a concept that still just unifies something. And like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is, I think, a good example of that. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is not a concept album, but Elton John had a specific vision for it.
He did.
He was actually inspired by the Beatles' White Album and how they were able to accomplish that variety too. I mean, the White Album does the same thing. Even though there's not a continuing narrative, there's still something about it that ties everything together from the very first track of disc 1 to the very last track of disc 2. It feels like a unified experience, not just that you threw more songs on top of the pile.
They have to be consistent to be legendary. That's a very good point. So that wraps up Velocities in Music's favorite double album list. As I said earlier, you can check out our full list at www.velocitiesinmusic.com, or if you're watching this via YouTube or listening to this via YouTube, we'll have it down below in the episode notes. You can go through the whole list, and what we're really interested in is hearing what your top 10 favorite double albums are, or any notable albums we didn't include in our list. We're really curious what you guys think are the best double albums and what makes a double album great. Give us your thoughts. www.velocitiesinmusic.com. Obviously, our YouTube channel is youtube.com/velocitiesinmusic. Hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Now, one little Velocities in Music public service announcement before we go. Tom and I do this, and we've been doing this for years, for fun, as we said earlier.
Yep.
We are not of the mindset that we want to have advertisements or ever have to ask for donations. We have found ways to continue Velocities in Music, and because we love it, and you guys do too, and what really resonates with us and what makes us want to keep doing Velocities in Music is your involvement. So thank you guys, first of all, for all of your participation, all of your thoughts, especially when we took our hiatus and you guys were just, wondering where we were and asking us to come back. That really was a big motivator. instead of donations or advertisements or any of that crap, we don't want to become that. What we want, though, is to resonate more with a wider Velocities and Music community. What we will ask of you is that if you like Velocities and Music and you like this podcast that we're doing, which, by the way, we really love doing and want to continue doing for the inevitable and never-ending future, we would ask that you share Velocities and Music with people that you think would get value out of it. It is absolutely important to Tom and I that we grow our base so that we can have more conversations, more ideas, and better podcasts over the years to come. So if you guys wouldn't mind, it would mean so much to us if you shared Velocities and Music with your friends and family and people you think would get a lot out of this, because we're really, you know, like we were jokingly kind of tongue-in-cheek saying we're the best kept secret in album reviews, but we don't want to be, right? Like we want to be a little bit more than that. I guess we don't want to sell out and go super corporate either. But we want to have a base. We want people to derive value from what Tom and I are doing here in Velocities and Music, and it's something that we hope to continue doing for the future.
Yep.
That said, thank you guys so much, and please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We love hearing from you. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music discussion. We'll end there.